Good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of Between the Pillars, the Fisher Library's video podcast series, where we get to meet Fisher staff, some non-Fisher staff, and we get to meet collections. My name is John Shoesmith, the Fisher's Outreach Librarian. It is May 6th, 2022 today, and we're deviating a little bit again from our normal practice of meeting Fisher staff, and instead doing what we did 2 weeks ago, where we met Alan Gailey, who's a prof at the iSchool. Today we're meeting Scott Schofield, who is an associate professor in the Department of English and Cultural Studies at Huron University in London, Ontario. But prior to that, he was what I would call, not unlike Alan, a super user and a super educator, especially using Fisher materials. They would use Fisher materials for their own research, but more importantly, they were using Fisher materials to educate the future book historians here in Canada. And Scott, I was thinking about this the other day, probably a day didn't go by in my first sort of few years that I didn't see Scott, since he was always here at the library. And we're going to talk a bit about that. So Scott's association, as I said, with Fisher has to do with his own research, his role as an educator. But he also, we're going to find out, did a bit of work at the Fisher, as well as curated one of our most successful exhibitions in the last 10 years. So Long Lives This, a celebration of Shakespeare's life and work, which ran in 2016. So we'll talk a bit about that exhibition as well. So welcome, Scott. It's great to see you. So here's a question that I think I started out with Alan as well. Do you remember the first time you visited Fisher?
Absolutely. Oh yeah, no, it's vivid.
You did a lot of your studies here at U of T as well.
I did, yeah. So this was during my graduate years. I did both my master's and PhD at U of T, and it was in bibliography with Randy McLeod.
Okay.
And if anybody knows Randy, he's also in the super user group.
Super user, yes. We saw him here. He was here yesterday, actually.
That's fantastic. No, I remember entering the room, entering the Fisher as anybody does, sort of being blown away by this space. Then coming.
Remember the time frame?
I want to say around 99 to
okay.
2000. Coming down the elevator, entering the room where teaching typically takes place.
This room?
There we go. And then, and just seeing probably 20, 30 books on a table, or a series of tables open to different sections. And before I even started, we just roamed about, and that was it. I was hooked already. I was like, oh my gosh, I need to come to this place more often. And and by the end of that class, I was starting to see books already in a new way. I don't know if it was settling in quite yet, in the way I'd come to understand them in the years ahead. But it was a really important moment. And I should say, since that time, Randy has really shaped a lot of my thinking on, especially materiality. And so that was a first. But as you say, many times after.
Do you think that first visit might have actually influenced in terms of the direction you took your own scholarship?
Yes and no. I mean, I ended up doing a PhD on 17th century Renaissance drama, which was dealing with sort of political religious issues. And so I would come to the Fisher to work with that material. But at least a large section of that thesis didn't have much to do with the rare books. So why was I there every day? Well, I was avoiding my thesis, I guess. But I think it was I knew that when I was finished my dissertation, that my next sort of route would be really book history oriented. And my research ever since then has been in variations of book history.
So how did you get involved then in teaching with the Faculty of Information?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'd finished my PhD. I was doing this small stint of cataloging actually at the Fisher. It was a brief stint.
Tell us about that actually before that. What were you working on?
Oh my gosh, that was incredible. So this is like a dream job where I was told.
I remember seeing you in the workroom thinking, who is this guy?
So the Shakespeare collection, in Shakespeare and Shakespeareana collection at the Fisher is mainly, or a large part of it's from Sidney Fisher, who was the brother of Thomas Fisher, the namesake of the library. And there was I want to say 200-300 books that had been received in 73 1973, but hadn't been cataloged.
Right.
And I was asked, would I catalog these? And I'm like, oh my gosh, I get to work on like my dream material,
Right.
16th century books, 17th century books. So it was about a 4-month stint. And it was in sort of the period after I'd submitted my dissertation, but I hadn't defended or I was in that sort of process. So I had this space. This came up. I don't remember it. Ann Donnerman would have been involved for sure. And then I ended up getting to work. And that was huge for me because it gave me also insight into rare book cataloging. Instead of seeing what I saw in the interface, typically on a screen, and to this day, I have deep respect for the work catalogers do and the challenges of finding that balance of what to include in a note and so on. So
I also seem to remember, just to interrupt, I seem to remember maybe with Luba saying, Scott's adding a lot more information than he thought.
Oh, yes, of course, Luba. Luba is very much involved in the decision too. And thank you to her for supporting it. But we debate on what to include in a 500 or a local note.
Right.
I'd say, well, you need to include this. She said, no, you don't. And so there was a bit of back and forth. And I think this is an ongoing discussion as a kind of side note that, patrons and librarians and finding a way to sort of join forces, carrying material on this. Because I often go into a rare book room, take a whole pile of notes, leave, and then put them on, I might not look at them ever again, or I've wrapped them up for an article I'm writing where they could easily be moved over or at least shared in some capacity. So,
right.
That's something to think about moving forward. So I was finishing up this stint, this wonderful stint, 4-month period. And this postdoc came up. And so I thought, well, I got to apply to that. It had to do with thinking about how the long history of the book might inform digital design.
Okay.
And so I applied to that postdoc, got the postdoc, and then found myself working with Alan Gailey. And it was in that capacity that I started teaching book history courses, graduate book history courses at the iSchool. And so that was another, all these sort of steps of, my sort of 700 days in a row in the Fisher, the cataloging at the Fisher and then teaching at the Fisher, all were hugely important in shaping sort of my understanding of book history, understanding rare book collections and so on.
And I know then you were approached, I can't remember what the year would have been, when they knew that 2016 was the anniversary of Shakespeare's death.
Yeah.
And they had an idea to do an exhibition. So what was the involvement there? Were you approached? Did you approach us about potentially putting forth this exhibition?
My memory is I was approached. Okay. I was approached, I think, and it might have been by Anne, or it could have been a collection of forces, and PJ Carefoot, Philip Oldfield. I mean, a number of people mentioned, and the idea was, and I don't know if it was my sort of response to sort of say, I would love to do this, but I would need a team.
Yeah.
Or somewhere in the dialogue, we decided that, and then that led to, Ann Donnerman playing a really important role. Peter Blaney, world expert on early modern printing. So grateful that he was able to join Marjorie Rubright, and as I mentioned, Alan Gailey. So I had this all-star team, I had this all-star team to work with. And then the actual catalog, which I have a copy here.
Oh, nice.
Was printed at Coach House Press right behind. A remarkable work by Stan, and of course the major exhibit and all the spaces of the Fisher were filled. So that was 2014, I believe, was the earliest discussions on that.
Right.
And again, like anything, you're like, oh yeah, that's in 2 years. I can do that.
And then you realize, first of all, 2 years is pretty quick, and also the time and effort and resources required to put together an exhibition of that size.
Enormous. Yeah. But one of the beautiful things is you also get to see all the different elements, curatorial elements, which we worked on together too for that. Yep. Also the conservation. We want to put that item on display. Well, we got to fix it first. So there's all these sort of
there's a lot of moving parts.
A lot of moving parts, and I think sometimes moving parts that are often invisible. Yeah. People don't realize how much work's happening behind the scenes. And and I think of Stan and his work at Coach House, going through 20 proofs. It's remarkable the and it's just the care and commitment from all sides. And so, yeah, no, it really gave me, I look at exhibits all over the world now totally differently.
Oh yeah.
After that experience, I'm like, wow, this is serious. I can just go in and sometimes be like, this is a lot of work, and
we're gonna show some items that were in that exhibition. But even before that, I mean, maybe we thought, you were a known quantity as well, because you'd worked on another collection here at the Fisher, the Forbes Collection. Maybe you could talk a bit about your role in terms of that collection.
Yeah, that was tied to one of the Friends of the Fisher lecture series, Seltzer, I believe, 2012. And I think this too was through a kind of dialogue and the idea of, nobody has really looked at the Forbes collection in a long time in a serious way. And I was totally taken by this collection. To give some context,
which, by the way, is just right up above my head here, just like right up there.
It's funny you say that, because whenever I bring students to the Fisher, when I was at U of T and ever since, we bring students from the Huron as well. I'll often point to it. I'll say, you see that? That's an entire library. So yeah, this Forbes library, a nonconformist clergyman, John Forbes, living in Gloucester, between around, I want to say 1640s to around 1700. In 1968, U of T purchases the library complete. And it's amazing because this library, none of the books in the library have been rebound. This is as close to getting a sort of taste of a library from the period.
Exactly.
So I think the title of my talk was kind of a library within the library. This idea of, and so when working on it, one of my sort of conditions was, I'll give this talk. I think it was a 60-minute talk. Happy to give the talk, but I need to see the books. And I remember one of the counters was, well, how many do you need to see? And I said, I want to see them all.
Oh, well.
And there's 1,500 books, right? So I found myself over about 3 weeks, I think it was, every day sort of trying to go through at least 50, 60 books.
Right.
And I was taking notes, and I was trying to understand each copy, what made it unique, and start to see pattern across this collection. What would it tell me? And I started to find amazing things. A couple of those items I'm going to talk about today.
Yeah, why don't we actually segue that into showing some materials, and starting with Forbes. I think we remember joking too at one point to do your you should have done your lecture from the actual second floor where the Forbes collection was, sort of overseeing us down below.
Some people would say, is he trying to be Moses up there? But
yeah, exactly.
So
let's start with this book. What are we looking at?
Yeah, so if we go to the title page to start, so we flip through here, this is a fairly typical early 17th century printed book in London, The Plain Man's Spiritual Plow, containing the godly and so on, by Carpenter. A number of copies still survive to this day, but I'd be surprised if another copy was bound like this one. And so one of the things I was mentioning when looking at the 1,500 books was starting to notice things that were unique about individual copies. And this copy is a prime example. It has what's known as printed waste. So that stuff there. So if you imagine a printer sort of, maybe he's made some errors in a sheet that he's printing. He puts those to the side. And sometimes we know that some of this waste was being sold in the period to binders, who would then use it to reinforce the binding. But in some cases, the waste can give us amazing insight into how printing took place. We can sometimes see copy that was being corrected or annotated. And so I kept finding copies, no surprise with the 17th century collection, in their original bindings, copies with this printer's waste. So this one is continental waste, so waste from books printed in Europe. And then even more exciting is the binding itself. So this binding is bound in limp vellum. So if you think of animal skin treated in a certain way, but it's actually a legal document. This is known as an indenture, an Elizabethan indenture. And indentures were often used for agreements, sometimes with property and the like. I haven't gone through and transcribed it, but it would be exciting to see how much of the indenture we have here. My guess is we've got a piece of it, but a pretty sizable piece. And so you start to think about, it's a reminder that you go looking for one thing in a collection and then suddenly you find other things.
Well, it's almost a story within a story, because this tells a story. This waste tells a story, and then you've got the book itself.
That's right. That's right. And then you think about, the typical stat where it might say, well, 14 copies of this book survive around the world. But until you go and see the copies, you don't really know them. And so not all, it's a reminder too that every copy is different.
Right.
In this period, even at the printing level, but especially when you're looking at the binding and so on. It also, reminds me about waste is a funny word, right? Because in many cases, waste in the back too. There's a signature, Richard. It looks like Hancock. Yeah. Waste is not waste at all. Like it's often an insight into the period, and it's a kind of early modern recycling, if you will. And I think about our own time and what we toss now and what we might find to be most valuable in later periods.
Great. So let's show one more from Forbes.
Yeah.
I love the size of this thing.
I know. You better start reading tomorrow if you need to.
Exactly.
That's right. Yeah, this is another exciting case. There's a 17th century continental imprint, and many of the Forbes books are tied in one way or another to politics and religion.
I was going to ask you that, whether there was sort of a thread of what he was collecting.
And no surprise for a clergyman, right? So this is, but again, what's so exciting to me about this copy is it's got a different kind of waste. This is sort of early modern correspondence.
Right.
And this is really exciting stuff because this is between two stationers. So stationers being the people in the period who do printing, publishing, bookselling. And it's John Bill and John Crosley. And they're discussing basically books that have been imported from the continent to England and having them sent. And I can't remember the order without looking at the book, but either from Oxford to London or London to Oxford.
Right.
But if you go to the back of the book, there's even more waste. And in there, if you pull up those little slips there, what you start to see at the bottom, so this is like a list, and it looks like prices for each of these books, or maybe numbers of books. It could be, but given that so it's usually pounds, shillings, pence, right?
Yeah.
So it's really exciting to think about this letter, getting reused for binding waste. Mm-hmm. And when we start to think about how this sort of activity took place in the period, we have very little of this, quite frankly.
Right.
Much of it is, no surprise, has been tossed either at the period or maybe after a time, somebody takes over and comes into the room and says, oh, what's this junk sitting around? Let's get rid of this. And next thing it's in the bin. So binding waste for me is very exciting because it gives us insight into print practice, bookseller practice. It's wonderful stuff. And I probably would say that, a good, at least 10%, if not higher, of Forbes books have waste of one kind or another in them. So that's its own sort of, and I've been thinking about that as a kind of project in the future, potentially.
So one thing I'm curious about then, and I don't know if you know the answer to this, I mean, would Forbes have bought these books bound like this, or would he have had them bound himself?
Yeah, this is a great question. We do know that some books were bought and then sort of taken, maybe they were just stab stitched,
right,
and then taken and had bound specially. In other cases, books were being bought already bound. I mean, this binding here, I've been talking about the waste, but this is a wonderful example of a 17th century, what we call blind tooled calf binding. Those ornaments you're seeing in the center, known as centerpieces, those are often clues to where books were bound. And many of the books, I know Forbes did some of his studies in Oxford. Many of those stamps are tied to Oxford and Cambridge. And I don't know this one off the top of my head, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's an Oxford stamp. So at the very least, we can say, this is a book that he's purchased or at some point was bound in Oxford. So that too gives us clues into another element of production. But this is a great question about whether, the only way we'd know that 100% is, did he write it down somewhere?
Right.
I purchased these books unbound. I mean,
Right.
if you ever find any of those notes, please.
We'll let you know. We've got your email address.
That's right.
So let's move on to let's talk about Shakespeare a little bit, and maybe talk about some of the things that you were showing in the exhibition. So should we start with this?
Yeah, sure. I think this one is the Favin. Yeah, okay. So let's go to the title page first. Just a couple pages in, and I'll give some context here. So one of the ideas when we were sort of working out how we were going to build this exhibit, as I realized, and this goes back to doing the cataloging you talked about earlier, of the Sidney Fisher, I realized we had this amazing collection of Jaggert material. So Jaggert, William Jaggert was the printer here. Printer of the first folio, so the Shakespeare complete work that comes out in 1623. But we also had all the works that were in production at the same time as the first folio. So I thought about for a moment, maybe we could do a whole section on Jaggert. And this would be exciting to think about a kind of context for how Shakespeare's works were printed. And what's really interesting is you have basically, 4 works in production, and 2 of those works, and quite large works, are books of heraldry. So it's interesting to think about, for a moment, the first folio, this most famous of all books, being one of several books being printed,
right,
and not sort of like stop the presses. Everything has to go to Shakespeare.
Wasn't it the other way around, probably?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, there is a fair bit of work that went into getting the rights for different plays and so on. So there clearly was an investment in the folio, but there is this sense too of the economics of any printer.
Right.
They need to make money, and but I think it's kind of.
And they weren't printing Shakespeare's plays because they knew we'd be still reading them 400 years later.
Yeah, I mean, there has been that debate whether the first folio was a chance, like would it sell? But this copy is beautiful as a book.
But these would be something that would be sort of a more known quantity, something that would be of interest, I assume.
Well, and I'll talk about this as I go, because Jaggert had already established himself as somebody who had printed heraldry,
right?
And plays for that matter. But this is this book here, and it's a beautiful copy, hand colored. So this is a book that's been printed, and then somebody's gone through and colored the different coronets and crowns and garlands and so on, and various.
Beautiful book, actually.
Yeah, it's stunning. Actually, it's funny you're on that page. If you can go back for a second. So one of the copies of Shakespeare's first folio at the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C. If you look carefully at it, you can see a kind of offset from that image at the bottom. So you can see a shadow of that image on one of the pages of Shakespeare. So it's as if they've laid some sheets down that haven't dried,
right?
And they've sort of bled a bit onto the Shakespeare folio page. So it's just another piece of proof of this production process.
I guess it's the advantage of that library having 200 copies or so, or 100 copies of the first folio, or whatever it is.
80 something, 200 and some odd. Yeah,
okay.
It's unbelievable.
We have one.
One of 2 in the country.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, it's beautiful.
It is really nice. Yeah, and those. So I should mention too, those images you're looking at before they're colored. Those are woodcuts.
Yep.
These are images cut into wood, which would be printed on the same press as we'd use the type for. So yeah, this page would be done the same way, and you've got those wonderful ornamented or decorative letters that are hand colored. Imagine we could look at every page, but we'd be here for a while.
Let's show one more then, at least one more from the Jaggert.
Sure. Oh, one thing with that book before you go, John.
Yep.
So just I forgot to mention it. It's just a quick note. If you open up the front cover,
yes.
Yeah, at the top there, we have all these book plates, which are exciting too. Reminder of later owners. We have a bit of printed waste, in this case, actually manuscript waste, I should say.
Yeah.
And then we have this little inscriptions here.
Let's see if I can focus that somehow.
Yeah.
There we go.
And it says, basically, I warrant this book perfect. and it's got the name of George Latham.
Mhm.
George Latham was a bookseller in the 17th century. And what this means essentially is that he's gone through the book to make sure it has all its pages or leaves, for using a technical term. So it's sort of collated and perfect. But again, you could look at 50 of these copies and not find this again. And back to the point about
More waste too, by the way.
yeah, more waste. And you rebind this book and throw away those end papers, and you start to lose this kind of evidence.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Great book. Yeah, and you did point out the book plates too. We have
Oh yeah, there's a
for
this
understanding where this book came from, the provenance.
that's right. They sort of, and that's always fun to trace too, is
Oh,
where
yes.
the book's been before and that provenance history.
I know they were doing quite a bit of that prior to the Shakespeare exhibition on the copy of the first folio as well. I know Anne Donterman did a lot of work.
I think she spent at least a year
Yes.
and trying to dig up, especially the more difficult possible connections. So yeah, this was in a second book that was in production at the same time. And you'll see the stamp in the top left corner of Sidney Thomas Fisher. That's the collection I mentioned before. And this has.
But he didn't have a book plate. He just had a stamp.
Oh, if you go the page before, you can see it. He's got a book
Oh,
plate.
yes. Okay, good.
Yeah. And so he's got the book plate. He's got the stamp. And then this book has what's known as an engraved frontispiece. It's a fancy word for title page. And it's worth mentioning, I was talking about woodcuts just moments ago. This book, that frontispiece would have been done with a copperplate engraving. So you need to use a whole different press to produce that. And it costs more money. So and again, if we think of a different kind of investment on the part of the printer, but it leads to a more refined image, as you can see here.
Yeah.
It's really beautiful shading and so on. And the first folio has the image of Shakespeare, which is also an engraving.
Yeah.
So think of 2 of the 4 books having engravings. If we go all the way to the bottom too of this book, I love this. It's signed by a guy by the name of Henry Lilly with the title of Rouge Dragon. I mean, if there's, I like my title of associate professor, but if I have another choice, I would love to be Rouge Dragon at some point in my lifetime. So we not only do we have, all these books that were in production with the first folio, but in this case, we have a book of heraldry, essentially, or at least with heraldic material, annotated, owned and annotated by another herald. So cool. Really exciting to think about this.
Old out here too.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful. Yeah. These maps. Oh, these beautiful, maps. These would have been engravings as well. Leicestershire, or Leicestershire, I think it is. This beautiful maps. And I think if around 280, around there, I was looking back at the catalog so I can remember this. 283 maybe?
Here we go.
There we go. It's a wonderful example of our Rouge Dragon annotating. Here he's basically gone through and he's sort of saying, yeah, that's fine. This needs to be changed. And then I love these X's like raw.
Yeah, no, let's take this guy out. Richard, Nicholas.
Yeah, they're gone. Or at least.
Although Richard does make an appearance back down in the.
Yeah, I mean, and one of the reasons that's sort of fueling this printing of heraldry is it's highly contentious.
Right.
These debates over family lines and the right to arms and all this. So you get a whole collection of these books in this period. And 2 of them being in production at the time. But this, as I just mentioned, great example of showing how books were both read and used in the period. I call it, scholars have often referred to this as a form of active reading. Right. So reading with pen in hand, which I still tell my students to do today.
Which is interesting too, because he's actually he's drawn the. Yeah,
it's wonderful. Yeah. Well, partially because when you're describing, or when you're doing a sort of heraldic achievement, or you lay out the name, the family, and so on, but then the sort of images within there are vital to breaking down family sort of lines and so on.
Okay. So let's put this aside. Let's go to. Should we start with this?
Sure, we can go. Yeah. So one of the points I wanted to make in the exhibition, and something I've been talking about today is that, prior to 1623, when the folio is produced and these other books, including two on heraldry, are produced, Jaggert was already producing heraldry for a couple of decades. This book is a smaller example of heraldry. William lays a Sedence of Armory with a wood. This is a woodcut title page. Yep. It's bound in limp vellum. It's kind of a harder vellum. And what's neat is that, this was a book that was basically, this was the last edition of it. It had been produced since at least the 1580s, maybe even 1560s, if my memory's right.
Yep.
And
this one's
Jaggert was, but I love the marketing, newly corrected and augmented, yes. As if to say, not that old shabby copy that you saw in the other booksellers.
This is the copy you need.
That's right. This is the one you need. So, this is interesting to think about a printer sort of putting out new material, but also saying, well, this interest in heraldry, people might want this too. Yeah. This bestseller, we might say, which has probably got 4 or 5 editions. We have a bit cruder coloring.
Yes.
This looks like me at age 7 or something.
Yes.
But yeah, and then you get like a lot of text, the arms.
Yeah.
So again, thinking about somebody like Jaggert coming to the folio and the works of heraldry I've been talking about with already familiarity with the genre. And it might explain why others reached out to him too, to have those books printed. Yeah. So that's one. And then I think the other one is a larger book. Yeah, this is a beautiful book, 1608. I love the title page. Yeah. I'll leave the Latin for PJ. But I
was telling Scott I was looking forward to him reading the entire title page to us in Latin.
No, I'll save that for the next talk. Okay. But this book, Book of Heraldry, I believe by Robert Glover, published in 1608, has the printer's device, and you don't see this on all of Jaggert's works, but this wonderful printer's device with this arm. You have 2 uses of the snake, what's known as the ouroboros, or this sort of snake was often seen as a kind of symbol of perfection, especially in this circular form. And you see here the tail in the snake's mouth. So this is also, we can think of this as not unlike, Mercedes or Volkswagen in that they have symbols, right? Yeah. You see this stamp and you're like, oh, that's a Jaggert.
Right.
So interesting to think about how these were used. And Jaggert has his name in Londini instead of London. Jaggert's name is in Latinized form, printed at the Barbican in 1608. And this, so this is a work, not unlike the work I just showed you, but one that we're a little bit more, looks like a little bit more cost. Right. You'll see as we move through it, you've got, wide margins.
Oh, yeah,
wide margins, like perfect for annotating, but also somebody who's willing to pay a bit more potentially to have this book printed. So they've gone through this and taken much care. I think somewhere late in that book, I don't know if you'll be able to find it, there's a wonderful illustration of Elizabeth the First in Parliament. We might have to do a sort of flip through, but if we find it, we do, and if we don't, we don't.
Yeah. Yeah. We should have done our research in advance.
I know. I wish I could give you but this is okay. This is one of the series of engravings.
Right.
And I've been talking about engravings today that are in. So these different sort of, if we think of dukes, earls, viscounts, all these sort of levels of status, and you've got these figures, and also dress that's tied to these individuals. Really interesting. So again, this is Jaggert printing in 1608, so approximately 15 years before. Here's another one, 15 years before the first folio. I'm doing this really high-end work, but also putting out works like Lay, which are a little bit more rough and ready.
How long did Jaggert last in business? Do you know? Do you know when?
Well, he dies almost right after the first folio.
Oh, okay.
But he's got others like there's Isaac. There's there's other Jaggers. There's even
Right.
that are tied to printing. So, but yeah, it is, and this question of how good his sight is by this, whether he's fully blind or, I often say you print 7 to 10 hours a day,
Right.
and do this for your job for your entire life with often very minute metal types.
Probably a lot worse than looking at a computer screen.
Oh yeah, no, it's brutal. I mean, we've been doing some letterpress printing here at Huron,
Right.
and it's hard. After about an hour, I'm like, oof.
Yeah. Your arms hurt. Everything hurts, right?
Everything hurts. It's it's a very physical act. But yeah, no, it's a beautiful, beautiful book, and it's bound in limp vellum, that really soft, almost creamy. And if you turn to the spine for a second, John, I just remembered this. You get this. This is beautiful too. This sort of early sort of use of a title. And we think of titles being on the spine, but in the Renaissance, they often start on what's known as the foredge,
right,
which is the sort of, you flip this, they'll write them actually on the side of the paper itself. So you would often find titles sort of written there.
Yeah.
But this is a great example too of a book in its early binding, if not its original.
Yeah. So we've kind of talked around Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Without actually showing any Shakespeare.
No, it's true.
That guy gets enough attention. But let's pull something out that is from the Fisher Collection. It's cataloged in Fisher, but it's actually a more contemporary version. So we're not showing the first folio.
No.
So what are we looking at here?
This is really special. So this was part of the section that Alan Gailey looked at. And this was mainly 19th and early 20th century sort of printings of Shakespeare. And what we have here is a copy of a 1914 edition of Midsummer Night's Dream with illustrations by Heath Robinson, but bound by the incredible Toronto bookbinder Robert Wu. This binding, I mean, I'm a binding nerd, just as I'm a printing nerd and so on, but this is among my favorite bindings of any binding I've ever seen. Right. I mean, here you've got, the fairies, you've got, this goat skin, it's all these beautiful inlays, use of gold and so on.
And I should say the document camera really doesn't do this justice.
Well, yeah, no, so, and it's amazing when I show students different books, you bring this on the table, it's a showstopper. It's instant, like they gravitate, what's this?
So let's go to the title page first of all.
Yeah, and then you get this wonderful, beautiful work of Heath Robinson, wonderful illustrations, which are, and mirrored in many ways with the binding.
Yeah.
That this is a theme. So it's not just simply, we'll use that particular edition, but it seems to me that Robert Wu is picking up on sort of the sort of illustrative technique of Heath Robinson.
And one thing I pulled out, which I wanted to show. So anything else you want to say about the binding?
No, well, the only thing I would say, and it is worth mentioning, is that, you have a book that's sometimes tied to a period that's famous for the book arts.
Right.
So, 1880s forward from William Morris and others, this real attempt to sort of bring back craft.
Right.
And so what we get with Heath Robinson in those illustrations is somebody who's, investing in how a book can be illustrated.
Right.
But that sort of legacy is still with us. And Robert Wu is part of that.
Yep.
You have people still printing by hand,
mm-hmm.
Doing absolutely amazing work. And I know this is something you are very interested in, John, and oversee. But then you have sort of binding also that's being done, that what we call is sort of craft binding.
Exactly.
And so I just wanted to mention that as sort of not, that these traditions, very much when we're talking about Jaggert in 1608, and Robert Wu binding of 2016, they're part of a
long tradition.
Yeah.
And one thing I pulled out as well, that great thing when Robert does bindings for us. So we have commissioned a number of bindings from Robert.
Yeah.
He also includes the archival work that's associated with the binding. So, and these to me are just as exciting as the final product.
Oh, I totally forgot about these. These are amazing. Yeah. I mean, here too, I think, one of the things I get excited about why I like annotated books or books with waste or, is that they give us access to the process.
Exactly.
And what you're seeing here is like the mock-ups
Yep.
for this binding, and so it's just wonderful. And of course the person who produced them is still alive. So
Yeah,
you get-
exactly.
you get those insights. So you get this wonderful, but again, you could see how in another sort of context, these get discarded. And over time, that's often been the case, that the work that goes into the work
Right.
is often tossed. But
And
with
you end up losing part of the story.
an essential part of the story. And if I recall correctly, these were actually displayed during the 2016 exhibit.
Yeah, I'm sure they would. I'm sure they would be displayed down here.
Yeah. Amazing stuff.
So that's Shakespeare. Now, what I wanted to sort of segue to as well is talk about your teaching and to talk about some of the things you've used as well in your teaching. And one of the things you requested that we wanted to look at today was this.
This orange box.
This orange box. Why are we bringing out boxes? So,
Yeah.
But then we open the box.
Oh, there we go.
3 volumes of something. So let's pull these
I remember, during the pandemic, we talked about unboxing things.
Right.
Like it was all those unboxing videos, but
yes,
it's I love just opening that box, and just as you're doing, you're not knowing what's inside.
Exactly. So
this is one of my favorite things. It's a 3-volume set in its original boards of Jane Austen's Emma.
So
printed in 1816. It's worth going to the title page for a second. So you get that half title, and then we get there we go. And Emma, if we can.
There's a lot of things to talk about in this. Let me just there we go.
Yeah, one thing I forgot, and when you brought out the copy, it's signed John Hamilton Gray. I'm not sure if that's Carntine, but it's dated 1816.
Yep.
So we have a contemporary signature, talking about provenance, and here this wonderful.
It would have been most likely the original owner.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So you've got this amazing connection. One of the things that's exciting to me, and one of the reasons I bring this out, is not only to show how this book likely was purchased at the time, in these sort of plain bluish gray boards, but it's a novel in 3 volumes by the author of Pride and Prejudice. It's not Jane Austen's name's not flashing on the title page, despite the fact that she's already produced Pride and Prejudice. So it reminds me of Emily Bronte and others, using pseudonyms like Kerr or Bell. The sort of stigma against female authorship, and so this is tied up in all this. But I also like the marketing of this, almost to say, if you liked Pride and Prejudice, and that was pretty impressive, you might like this too.
Exactly.
So it's really exciting. And there's always, most groups of students, especially literature students, there's always somebody in the crowd who's a big Austen fan, and is really excited to see this particular book. But can
you tell us why it would have been produced in 3 separate volumes?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, I think one way of thinking about this is we have to remember that most novels in the 18th and 19th and even into the 20th century started as serialized copies. So they were often appearing in periodicals and journals, much like our episodes do. Although we can binge watch, I guess you could do in the period. But the this idea of like getting an episode meant you're getting 20 pages instead of Bleak House at 1200 or something.
Right.
You get it over 2 years.
Right.
But this idea of these being sold in either as in full books or as in volumes, is really interesting. And sometimes the volumes coming out, perhaps periodically. But yeah, it's just to remind. Your question's a great one, because it's part of the reason for bringing this onto the table is to say, how is this different from your 2022 edition of Emma? What do you learn? And even before this, I think the page before is a dedication.
Yeah.
So when we think about patronage too, and the idea of getting patronage that is support, financial and other kinds of support. And we often refer to these bits that sort of precede the main story as paratexts.
Yeah.
So the title page, the dedication, all these things shape the reading experience. And so going to these original copies allows me as a teacher to really explore these things. And, you know, some of that is me bringing books to the table. What's even more fun is having students bring stuff to the table that they're interested in, and starting to find what's different about the copy they might be looking at, how it was printed. So what does this material item tell us about the work in its earliest phases, and how that might differ from what we know of it now.
Should we cross this out and put Jane Austen?
Well, I'm not going to recommend that.
Okay.
It might get you in trouble.
Okay. Yes, lovely book. Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's a great thing, as you know, people sometimes will come to the library and will be quite surprised that we don't actually, you know, fix bindings. I mean, maybe you could talk about one of the reasons why we don't do that.
Well, again, I think we saw this starting with the books I looked at with the waste material. You know, that second book's quite brittle.
Yeah. You
could imagine somebody saying, well, let's toss the binding, the end papers, rebind it, and suddenly we don't have that correspondence anymore.
Yeah.
You know, here we might be saying, well, these are just some plain old boards.
Right.
But maybe that gives us a clue to, you know, where these books were being purchased.
Right.
Or how they were being sold. So the binding becomes yet another piece of evidence. I often think of rare books as a bit like an archaeologist visiting a site.
Right.
They're very careful, and they don't want to just, you know, go digging away. They want to make sure that they don't disturb where things were and so on. And books are like this for me, that you sometimes don't know what you're even looking at, that you might not realize that binding's of any significance.
Right.
And you do a bit of secondary research, and suddenly it's like, oh, yeah. Other
Exactly.
books are being sold in these bluish gray boards, and
Right.
who else was being sold this way, and so on. So it's
because often you'll see these first editions, you know, rebound by, you know, someone who's maybe owned it in the 19th or 20th century in these beautiful deluxe leather bindings. But in some ways, you know, these are more exciting to us as book historians.
Absolutely, and no, that's a great prompt, because you know, the vast majority of the Shakespeare first folios
Right.
survive, and I think it's somewhere around 220, 30. Like more than 95% of them are or 90% of them are bound in later bindings.
Yeah.
You know, partially because they became so collectible.
Yeah.
So the more collectible a book, generally speaking, the more likely it is rebound. So yeah, so that's another reason why when I see a copy like that, and this has got like, not only do you have the first edition,
Right.
but you've got it in the 3 volumes, in the blue boards, and signed by a guy in 1816.
Yeah, exactly. It's got
Yeah,
it all.
That's it. Like, it's the dream copy for me.
Yeah,
right.
exactly.
So yeah, all valuable stuff.
Do you ever have a sense of how many books you've looked at Fisher?
I don't know.
Scott, for those that might remember, in terms of how books used to be ordered, you know, we used to come in with these Scott used to come in with these pink slips that we have, and hand it to the reference librarian working at the desk and say, okay, these are what I'm looking for. Well,
you know, it's so funny you bring that up, because I would sometimes grab a stack of them,
right,
and start filling them out on the subway on the way in. That's like, oh, that's going to take me a while when I get there.
Yeah. And then, of course, Tom Reed was the one responsible for bringing that up, saying, "Oh, great, Scott again."
Oh, yeah. I have to say, like, it's got to be close to 5,000.
Right.
You know, I know. There's several. What is it? How many books in the Fisher?
Oh, we now have somewhere about 750,000 volumes, is what we tell.
I've still got a ways to go, but
a ways to go.
A couple more
ways to go. And the great thing is, I mean, obviously we've been in a pandemic for the last 2 years, but even when you went to Huron, you were still bringing your classes, here. So, I mean, that's
and now working on both materials at Huron and Western. Like, it's wherever I go, if there's rare books, look out. I'm gonna come find them. Right.
Here comes Schofield.
Oh yeah. No, it's so true. But no, it's back to, you know, you're mentioning Tom Reed, and he'd probably see me come in and be like, oh God, here we go again. But the team that is Fisher over the years has been so incredible. I think of yourself helping me with the wonderful podcast and so on for the Shakespeare exhibit. And
yes, I remember doing the road trip down to London.
That's right. The Golden Mike, I remember.
That's right.
And Philip Oldfield, many conversations with him over the years, helping out, and PJ Carefoot. And of course, I mentioned Peter Blaney.
Mm-hmm.
And the late Richard Landon, you know, so many. Ann Dodderman was unbelievable. I think she was like 5 people in one.
Yes.
And was so helpful in bringing about the exhibit. And so, you know, my going back when I visit the Fisher is always, you know, it's like a kind of coming home.
Yeah.
It's one of the many homes I've had over my years of academic homes, but it's really exciting. And so it's as excited as I am to see the books, seeing the, you know, staff and faculty and so on, and Alan Gailey, of course, as mentioned.
Well, we hope come September or October, the fall, that you might be able to bring classes back here again, because we always enjoy you coming here. And I think you're going to want to come anyway in the fall, because we're having our exhibition on medieval manuscripts. So I'm sure you'll want to see that. I'm sure you want to expose your students to that as well. So
I've already got it written down. I mean, in part because I'm just starting teaching some new courses and a new minor here in book history.
Oh, great.
So this is a perfect group to say, let's get the Fisher bus ready. Or via or whatever. I think the train's better for coming to Toronto, but
we'll be ready for you.
All right.
So anyway, Scott, this has been great. This has been a nice sort of nostalgia trip for me as well, because as I said, you know, you were almost a daily presence for us here at the Fisher, and always super affable, super friendly, and it's great. You've always appreciated the work. We're colleagues in many ways. So, and that's always been an important part of us working with the educators here and the users. So this has been nice. It's been fun for me.
Oh, it's been amazing for me, and thank you for letting me reminisce and celebrate.
So hopefully we'll see you, as I said, in the fall. Hopefully I'll see people watching this podcast in another couple of weeks. Not sure who the guest is. I'm planning on approaching someone whose name has been mentioned in this podcast. So in terms of tempting people who might be the next guest, you'll have to watch our website or watch the YouTube page to see who that's going to be. So again, Scott, thanks again. As I said, we'll see everybody in 2 weeks' time, and have a great weekend.
You too. Thank you.